Thank you. Bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Welcome. It's just brilliant to be here again at the conference. Harun, thank you, and thank you to the team for putting this together. And I hope everyone's well and warm at this part of the equator. So my topic is, I thought I would introduce Malana Ashraf Thanvi rahmatullah alayh to sort of the wider English audience, particularly the theme being about viability of kalam, and the text that I hope to go through in a bit of sort of in broad strokes. I have a handout which is available. I sent a link that's got more details on it. But what I hope to do in this text is to try and sort of present it to the audience to see, is this a text that is sufficient as a kalam apologetics text? And so I hope maybe we can get some discussion going for our panel. Right, so the text we're looking at is Al-Intibahat al-Mufida an al-Ishtibahat al-Jadida, which is a text written in Urdu, and it was translated in English actually a few decades ago under the title Answer to Modernism. And then there was an Arabic translation done as well a couple of decades back, and I think a new edition has been published of the Arabic, so it's up there on the screen. So the English and the Arabic is there. A new fresh English edition will be coming out bi'idhnillahi ta'ala soon with Turaf Publishing, by a very young scholar and academic, Sheikh Asim Ayub. He's done the draft translation, and myself and Dr. Shuaib Malik are revising it, and then we'll be getting it checked by His Eminence Mufti Taqi al-Uthmani Hafidhahullah, and then hopefully it will be out with some annotated notes. So that will be a new edition of the Urdu text coming out soon, inshallah. Okay, this is what I hope to cover in the next 45 minutes that Sidi Harun has given me. Thank you very much. I've got the Intibahat and its aims, Kalam Jadid in the text of Al-Intibahat, an overview of it, but I'm not going to go through the overview because of time. And then I'm going to talk about some foundational principles that Hakim al-Ummah Ashraf al-Thanvi rahmatullah alayhi puts in the text. And then I'll look at an example, and then we'll see what might be some possible criticisms of the text itself. So that's the kind of overview. Let's get started at the aims of the Intibahat. So Hakim al-Ummah wrote that in the last century, the beginning of the 20th century, and the aim really was to address objections raised by what he calls predominantly modernist scientists against foundational Islamic doctrines and beliefs. And for him, it's generated confusion and doubts in the mind of Muslims, particularly young Muslims. And so he wrote this work as intended to be an ongoing project to address these doubts and confusions. The method he uses is that of classical kalam. Now, classical Ash'ari or Maturidi, most likely, it seems from the text, it is broadly Maturidi. But anyway, it's in the classical kalam mode, classical kalam model, the model of kalam that is pre-Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, or sort of up to the Ghazalian time. And so that's his method. Now, the key term, I guess, for our conference today is the Kalam Jadid aspect. How does this relate to Kalam Jadid? So Mullah Thanvi mentions that, a couple of senses of Kalam Jadid. Now, he does mention that he's quite skeptical of it. So if, for example, if by Kalam Jadid is meant an entirely new Kalam with new principles and ideas, then this will be a misplaced endeavor, because the older classical Kalam is sufficiently address matters related to the foundational doctrine. So if Jadid is a methodological sense, then this is problematic. And he mentions that right at the beginning on page 5 of the Urdu edition. And he says that some people, because of newly arisen doubts, feel we need a new method of kalam. But what he's open to actually is he goes लेकिन باعتبار تفريق उसकी सेहत मुसल्लम हो सकती है. But he does say that if we mean by finding out more sub principles or making extensions of classical kalam, that's fine. That's fine. I.e., if we're extending the old classical doctrines and finding out new branches and sub principles, that's okay. But for those who are looking for a new kalam, for him it's misplaced. Now, if by kalam jadid though you mean, or the new sort of theologians, if they mean by the responses given to these new problems and new doubts, if these old problems and old doubts and challenges are in new guises, and there are genuinely new doubts and challenges, that any responses to them from the classical kalam, we can term that as new. So if we mean by new merely a temporal sense, then that's fine. So it looks like from the intibahat, he means kalam jadid in the sense of a temporal sense, but not a methodological sense. So that's how I'm reading the text. Okay, so what is the overview of the intibahat? So the overview of the intibahat is, it's, as I say, in 3 parts. There's part 1, the preliminary counsels. So he talks about why there is a need to respond to these new doubts and challenges, what they are, and they're mainly from the science quarters. Part 2 is the hikmah section, or the hikmah the hikmah classification and hierarchy is part 2. And then part 3 is the 16 notes or intimations, intibahat, where he goes through addressing various objections and challenges to not only foundational doctrines of Islam, but matters of usul al-fiqh, jurisprudence, and matters of sharia. Because actually, Mullah Tanvi's concern is the repealing of the doing away with, the undermining of the Sharia Mutahara, the law of Allah Azza wa Jal. So he's very, very concerned about that. And he believes that the doubts, the newly arisen challenges are there really to undermine the Sharia. And so that's on his radar. That's particularly what he sees as the major danger. So that I'm not going to go through the 16, the summary of the 16 intimations. You can find that in the handout where I summarize all of. So moving on to looking at the foundational principles, and this is what I want to return to really, because the Intibahat mentions that there are 7 foundational principles that Hakim al-Ummah is going to use, that he thinks that the reader should draw on and use when addressing these doubts. So the first principle is the principle of, I've labeled these in bold. You won't find these labels in the Intibahat, you just find numbers, but I've labeled them just for my own sake anyway. I'm more than happy to revise them. And in the handout as well, I formalized the principles for those who are interested in epistemic and who are interested in logic. So principle of incomprehensibility. So Hakim al-Ummah mentions, just because we do not understand something, it doesn't mean it's false. So just because something is beyond comprehension, it doesn't mean that the particular doctrine or idea is false. The second is what I'm calling the principle of rational possibility and authentic proof. So if something is logically possible, i.e. there's no formal contradiction in affirming it, and it's been authentically proven from revelation to either exist, to exist, then we must believe in it. So if it's not a rational impossibility, i.e. a logical impossibility, and revelation has affirmed it, then we must believe it. If something is a rational similarly, if something is authentically proven by revelation to have not occurred or existed, then we have to believe it not to have occurred or existed. Obviously, if something is logically impossible, then we leave it on pains of rationality. So number 3, the principle of rational impossibility versus empirical improbability or unlikeliness. So something being logically impossible, if something logically impossible cannot happen, if something is logically impossible that cannot happen, but but it doesn't mean that something being improbable still cannot occur. So just because if we establish something as logically impossible, that's one thing. But if we establish something as improbable, that does not mean that it doesn't exist. So something being it doesn't exist. Number 4, the principle of existence beyond empirical proof. So just because we cannot empirically prove something, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And he's going to return to that principle a few times in the work as well. Number 5, the principle of transmitted proof. He says that asking for logical proof for something that's been transmitted, i.e. something that's been historically reported, or something reported via testimonial proof, to ask for logical proof is misplaced. Because testimonial proof and historical proof are valid forms of proof. To then ask, give me a logical proof to substantiate your historical claim or your testimonial claim, that is misplaced for him. The principle of precedent versus proof. He says precedence and proof are two different things. If something doesn't have a precedence, it's not valid to ask that the truth of a claim depends on whether there is a precedence or whether there has been a precedence for it or not. Number 7, the principle of contradiction in rational and transmitted proofs. And this is the idea of al-qanun al-ta'wil, the canon of interpretation. There are rules when rational and transmitted proof apparently conflict with different outcomes depending on the strength of the rational proof and the strength of the transmitted proof. Obviously, a rational proof that's definitive, that's certain, that's qat'i, and a transmitted proof that is both definitive and certain, that's qat'i in both its in its transmission and in its meaning, cannot contradict. But where you got sort of rational proof and you got a probable report, a rational proof would obviously take precedence and things like that. So he has a canon of interpretation that's well known in the Kalam tradition, and he follows that. Okay, so let's take an example. So if we take the second intimation, which is about divine omnipotence and miracles, what is the dialectical layout in that? The dialectical layout, as I see it, is like this. So Maulana Tanvi mentions that some people in his time, particularly Muslims who are scientists and rationalists, they deny miracles on pain of it contradicting the laws of nature, i.e. on pain of it sort of contravening the laws of nature, and contravention of the laws of nature are impossible. So Maulana Tanvi says that this is problematic to believe this, because it denies saintly miracles and it amounts to denying prophetic miracles. So he begins by stating his opponent's position or his interlocutor's position, which is that it is impossible for anything to happen contrary to the laws of nature. And if it's impossible for something to happen contrary to laws of nature, then that has an impact on divine omnipotence. God cannot undo the laws of nature. And if the laws of nature cannot be undone, then there cannot be then the possibility of prophetic miracles and saintly miracles is thrown out the window. So what's his next step in the dialectical process? He then challenges the basis of the opposing argument. So he will challenge the logical and empirical basis of the opponent's argument of their claim. He points out that the claim of the impossibility of breaking the laws of nature is based on limited human experience, because it's an inductive generalization. And so if it's an inductive generalization, it cannot conclusively prove that miracles are impossible, because inductive generalizations, inductive reasoning is merely probable. It doesn't give us certainty. Then the next step in the dialectical layout is the logical counter argument. So Tanvi argues that the improbability of an event, like a miracle based on inductive reasoning, doesn't equate to its logical impossibility. So we mustn't conflate improbability with logical impossibility, i.e. formal impossibility. So just because we have not experienced a breach in the laws of nature does not mean it cannot happen. And you can refer to principles 2, 3, 4, and 7 of the 7 foundational principles that I mentioned. But then Tanvi mentions that what about those people who forget the rational argument? They accept, okay, we accept your rational argument. We accept your rational argument. But what about if we make an interpretation of the Quran to say that the laws of nature cannot be violated? And this is the idea of the sunnatullah, Allah's habit or custom or divine practice, having no change. You will not find any change in the sunnah of Allah, in the habit or custom or practice of Allah. So Mawlana Ashraf Tanvi mentions that this is a hermeneutical issue now. This is not a metaphysical or a logical issue or an issue to do with reasoning. Here it's to do with hermeneutics. And he says that those who argue that the sunnah of Allah, the habit or custom or pattern of Allah, refers to the unwavering nature, the unwavering status of the laws of nature, they are mistaken. They are mistaken. Rather, it looks better to say, stronger to say, that the sunnatullah, the habits of Allah, are the divine promises and warnings, not the immutability of the natural laws. So that might be a better tafsir of what sunnah means than to make it refer to immutable laws of nature. So in this way, that was just an example, sort of rushed through. We can see how he's applying foundational principles that he's mentioned, the 7 foundational principles, to 16 issues to do with divine, 16 issues to do with Islamic doctrines and precepts. That was just a sort of dialectical snapshot of what he's doing in all of the 16 intimations. He doesn't always do it with such rigor and precision, but this is what he's trying to do. Now, with that example said, and the few minutes that I have left, I want to just conclude with some possible criticisms of the intibahat that can be raised. And this is the broader question of whether classical kalam is viable for contemporary issues and challenges. One, there may be a criticism that the old kalam, if we are interpreting it as classical kalam, whether it's comprehensive enough. Because Hakim al-Ummah mentions that classical kalam is both kafi or wafi. It's comprehensive and robust enough to deal with any doubts challenging the foundations of the creed. Second, does this classical kalam have an archaic nomenclature? i.e., is the language out of date? Does that need sprucing up? Does that need updating? Is the old kalam dialectically robust, i.e., as a method of engaging an interlocutor? Is the kalam jadal style? Does that work? And finally, is the methodology of the intibahat consistent? So does Hakim al-Ummah use his methodology consistently throughout the 16 intimations? So all the issues that he addresses, does he address them in a methodologically consistent way? I.e., does he apply classical kalam consistently, or is he stepping outside of the kalam methodology? So, I mean, that's pretty much sort of an overview of the al-intibahat al-mufida of Mawlana Ashraf Tanvi rahmatullah alayh. It's a small work. It's written for a general audience. It wasn't written for the scholarly audience. To me, in sort of a concluding remark, the text is more a kind of a way of an example to show, a loose way to show how the method of classical kalam can be applied to some of the matters being addressed, some of the doubts being raised by modernists in his time, and how to address it. So I'll conclude it there. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين وجزاكم الله خيرا for giving me the opportunity to present.